Okay, this is part 4 of the lecture. Okay, so we have talked about evidence from the second language perspective. So now we'll move on to this question: what happened if we cannot acquire a first language during the critical period? So what happened then? Because if you remember during in the first or second lecture, in the previous lectures, we talk about that critical period hypothesis. There's a biological event and there's the linguistic event. So these two events must occur simultaneously, meaning you must have a good brain. Not only that, you must have a linguistic environment in which someone speaks to you. But you see, what would happen if you are deprived of your first language during the critical period? So we'll see some of the cases from your textbook. Yeah. All right. Number one, the case of Jem. Let me just make it bigger. Right. All right. So Jem is a hearing child, normal child of deaf parents. Okay, so because of deaf parents, he doesn't have this exposure to spoken language up till 3 years old. So his spoken verbal language is merely from the television. Okay, so you see, that's why I mentioned this in one of our lectures, or I don't remember, but I have mentioned this. I know I have mentioned this, that human beings, we are social animals. I don't like to use animals. We are social beings. Yeah. We are social homo sapiens. That's the scientific word. So social homo sapiens. So even for our brain, we have that domain in which that part where we communicate, socialization is also there. Meaning, even when it comes to language, it's not the same in terms of a media context versus the social context. Social context is direct communication. You will communicate with other human beings directly. Okay, so it's not the same with the case of you acquiring language through the TV. TV is the secondary, secondary source. It's not a direct source. Primary source would be the human being. So I'll post a video by this very prominent scholar. So she talk about how the difference between Mandarin children who acquire language from a Mandarin speakers who come to their house versus Mandarin children. The experiments involve two groups. So those two babies are American children. So one group had Mandarin friends. Some of their parents' friends came over and speak to them in Mandarin. So the other group do not have that human source. Yeah, they don't have these nanny or friends coming over speaking Mandarin, but these babies are only exposed from the television. So they look at what happened after 1 year, or I think after 6 months, so 6 months to 1 year, and they found that those babies were exposed to human being. It's much their comprehension improved, but not the babies from the TV group. All right, even though the utterances are the same, the utterances are all the same. So human beings, cognitively, in terms of our brain, there is this part where the socialization is part of the domain. Right, we are social beings. Yeah, so television doesn't help. In the case of Jim, what they found after 3 years, so his exposure was only from television. They found that when he's rescued by the social workers, his intonation was only flat. Okay, his articulation, meaning the way he speak, is cannot be understood, and his grammar is all over the place. Okay, but you have to bear in mind, Jim is very young. So after intervention, meaning after he's rescued, just a mere matter of few months, his language use becomes normal again. Okay, so Jim's case suggests that exposure to language alone is not sufficient to acquire language normally. This is what I have always mentioned. All right, it must be in social context. It must be in interactional context. So if I ask you, I think most of you do not speak Japanese. So now I ask you, please start. I want you to start watching Japanese movie. Maybe by next year, I want you to acquire the language. That's not going to happen unless you have a Japanese person in your household who speaks Japanese to you. So that's different. right? Here, language must happen in social interactional context, right? Okay, so that's the case of Jim. Okay, Jeannie is the most popular case in psycholinguistics. So what happened with Jeannie is this, yeah? Jeannie, she's abused, so she's deprived of language from 20 months up till almost 14 years. Yeah. So what happened was the parents isolated her in a small room and strapped her into a chair. Yeah. So this is entirely child abuse. Yeah. So at the age that when she's rescued after 14 years, scholars have been asking this question: Can she learn language because the parents did not speak to her, right? So they found that with training, Jeannie learned some language skills, but they found that her syntactic development, which means her grammatical development, was always impaired, meaning she wasn't able to acquire the grammar in a manner that those native speakers can acquire it, but she can acquire the vocabulary. Okay, so she used few question words, far fewer grammatical words. All right, in the case of Jeannie, this is what mentioned in your textbook, as I keep repetitively asking you to do, is you have to question these findings. Number one is that in the case of Jeannie, she's abused, right? So and for 20 months to this is 20 months, meaning 1.5 year up till 14 years. This is not just linguistic, this is not just the whatever Jeannie have, okay, because she has impairment in her in her grammar, she had difficulty acquiring language. I don't think this is linguistic issues. This is far more damaging. This could be cognitive issues. Imagine you being isolated for 14 years in a small room. What would happen? That's the trauma itself. So yes, of course linguists say this, but when I read that case, I was wondering, come on, 14 years, it couldn't, linguistic is not the main issue here. We have to check her brain, okay, we have to check her psychology, we have to check so many things. Okay, this is a child who's been abused for years. Okay, if you are, I think during lockdown, we are not abused, but lockdown has limited our interaction with human beings, right? You can feel yourself breaking down. Your mind, your mental state is breaking down too. This is just lockdown. Imagine what Jeannie is experiencing. So yes, you can say this, but I would argue that researchers should check about the cognitive damage as well, and the trauma, the psychological state. All right, these might play a more role than just linguistic exposure. All right, okay, so let's look at the case of Isabel. Okay, so Isabel was kept from infancy with minimum attention with her deaf-mute mother. Okay, so this is similar to Jim. But she's when she's rescued, she was 6.5, still very young. Okay, when they rescued her, they found that her intelligence is around for similar to a 2-year-old child, so it's a little bit delayed, but similar to Jim. She only takes after 18 months, then she was back to normal. She becomes linguistically competent. All right, but you have to bear in mind, Jim and Isabel, they are not abused. It's just that they had how do you control? They had this misfortune of having a deaf-mute mother. You can't. How do you? This is fated. Okay, this is their fate. They have parents who are deaf and mute. Okay, so it's not something that you can control. Right, but bear in mind also that they are also young, very young when they are rescued. Yeah, okay, so what can we deduce from the cases is that, okay, here, children, they seem to recover from whatever trauma if this linguistic deprivation, right, as they receive input, if they receive input early enough. So at what age what do you mean by receive input early enough? I would say that during the critical period from birth to adolescent. But what happened to Jeannie? Jeannie, as I said, as I have mentioned so many times, that's not a linguistic issue. That's more like a major issue there, right? But at that point, they haven't, scholars or doctors did not check her, did not check her brain, right? Okay, so but if the issue is merely linguistic deprivation, in the case of Jim and Isabel, yes, they would recover if they receive input early enough, right? So if deprivation continues, language development, particularly syntactic development, is impaired. Syntactic is referring to the grammatical development, just like what Jeannie experienced. Yeah. Okay. Alright, because of that, scholars have revised the critical period hypothesis. They say that if children don't receive any input during the critical period, they won't acquire language normally. This we can reject because children can acquire language outside of the critical period. Alright, they can. Alright, lateralization doesn't seem to happen completely within a critical period. So it seems like no, lateralization does happen throughout life. Okay. Alright, so here they propose a new critical period hypothesis. They call it sensitive period hypothesis. So it's similar to critical period. It's just the milder version, the weakened version of the critical period hypothesis. So the evidence seems to support the weaker version. There is a sensitive period for language acquisition, meaning, yes, of course, there's this optimum time, very optimum time for children to acquire language, but it seems to confine to a certain aspect, which is the syntactic processing, and the other one that I've mentioned before is the phonological processing, the accent and all that. So it doesn't cover, this sensitive period does not encompass the whole thing, because even for Jeannie, that our abuse victim, what happened was she still can acquire the vocabulary, right? Even with the suspected cognitive damage, suspected of the trauma, suspected of trauma and all that, right? But she still can acquire words. Meaning, you can still acquire language, but this critical period, this optimum time, yes, of course, you should acquire language as early as possible. The best would be as early as possible, but if you don't have that opportunity, so you realize that when you're adult, I want to learn another language. Yes, you can, right? You can learn another language. It's just that maybe it might be difficult in terms of syntactic processing. Yeah, you remember how you learn language, how you learn English. It is difficult to learn the vocabulary. Yeah, and number two, the sound itself, the phonological, the accent, it would be there. All right. Okay, so that's all for this topic. This is a very heavy topic, as I keep mentioning, so please listen to my lectures several times. I need you to understand it first. Then next week, hopefully, next week, inshallah, we'll have the Zoom session and ask me question during that Zoom session. Yeah. All right. Thank you. See you next week.